Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this special podcast on the issue of immigration. And specifically, it's a commentary on a recent debate that took place at the SOHO Forum in New York City between two very prominent libertarians, Dave Smith and Alex Nowasteh, on the issue of immigration. Ostensibly, the debate as being government-controlled borders versus open borders, but as we'll see, that really wasn't the debate at all, which has become somewhat customary, unfortunately, in these types of debates regarding immigration. And you'll see what I'm talking about as we go further into the commentary on this debate. But following the debate, there was also a podcast by another very prominent, brilliant, eloquent libertarian named Bob Murphy. And then another podcast that consisted of Bob Murphy and another brilliant, prominent libertarian named Adam Haman. And so what I want to do is focus in on the arguments that were made in favor of government-controlled borders in this debate, to show you how fallacious they are. Now, let me preface this by saying these are some of the most brilliant, prominent, eloquent, insightful libertarians you'll ever find, which is why I see this as an opportunity to address their arguments in favor of government-controlled borders. I learned this from Milton Friedman. When Friedman was going on the attack against occupational licensure, he could have picked out occupational licensure for hairdressers or shoe shine people or whatever to show that licensure was illegitimate and harmful. But he felt that no, that really wouldn't do the trick, that what he needed to do is show that occupational licensure was illegitimate in the toughest case, which was the medical profession, to show that you shouldn't have occupational licensure in the medical profession, because he felt if you can show the fallacies there, then everything falls into place, the hairdressers and so forth. So these libertarians, Bob Murphy, Adam Haman, Dave Smith, are the premier, the creme de la creme of the libertarian movement in terms of understanding libertarianism and making the arguments in favor of libertarian positions. And so tackling their arguments on immigration control is to me the way to go at it. And now let me preface this by saying that in the libertarian movement now, I think it's safe to say that there's some libertarians that now claim that there's two positions in the libertarian movement and in the libertarian philosophy: government-controlled borders and open borders. Okay, they say it's kind of like a cafeteria. You can take your pick, but they're wrong. Okay, there are no two positions on immigration in the libertarian movement. Libertarianism is an internally consistent philosophy. There are no contradictions in libertarianism. So the libertarian philosophy does not consist of, government-controlled borders and open borders at the same time, and you're in a cafeteria line, take whatever you want, and you're adopting a libertarian position. It doesn't work that way. It's like the same as saying that drug legalization and drug criminalization are both part of the libertarian philosophy, because there's people that support both in the libertarian movement, and so therefore you can go ahead and take your pick and you're still adopting a libertarian position. No, it doesn't work that way. It's either one or the other. Now, the immigration control libertarians claim that their position of immigration control is the libertarian position, not open borders. Okay, so how do we resolve this? I mean, what they're really saying is that the position held by Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals in the progressive sense of the term, they're holding a libertarian position on immigration, and they've been holding this for decades. The whole immigration control system, the Border Patrol, ICE, and everything, that lo and behold, they've been holding the libertarian position the whole time, and the libertarian movement, which has been holding the open immigration position, has been wrong the whole time. I mean, that's really what they're saying, is that the real legitimate libertarian position is government control borders. Now, obviously, there's libertarians who have come in from the conservative movement who hold non-libertarian positions, and I think a lot of them would acknowledge that. If you take, for example, the drug war, there's libertarians that come in from the conservative movement. They're dissatisfied with Republicans, out-of-control spenders, and other things that have got them upset, maybe foreign wars. And so they come into the libertarian movement, but unfortunately, they have not been able to let go of their baggage. They bring their baggage with them, and they say, "Oh gosh, I can't believe you libertarians believe this." Of course, you ask, "Well, what are you doing here?" "Well, I got dissatisfied with the Republicans." Okay, so you come in, but a lot of them acknowledge that they've come in with baggage, not on immigration. You see, that's kind of interesting. Immigration is the exception, but they come in with other baggage, like drugs. They'll say, "Well, okay, I can go with you libertarians on marijuana legalization, but not on heroin and cocaine and fentanyl and other things like that. Opioids, no. That we got to keep criminalizing that." But it seems like when they do take that position, they realize that it's not a libertarian position, that they just not in sync with libertarians, and they just disagree with libertarians. Or if you take Social Security, a lot of the conservatives come in and say, "Oh no, we've got to have Social Security, but I'll go with you guys where we can phase it out over the next 50 years. Okay, I'll go that far." Okay, so you live under this non-libertarian socialist position for 50 years. But I think that deep down they understand that's not really libertarianism. Libertarianism and socialism are opposites. Okay, they're, again, contradictions. And of course, Social Security is a classic socialist program developed by socialists in Germany, as a matter of fact. And they don't call it Social Security for nothing. But again, they recognize that they've brought in their baggage, and it's not libertarian. They just haven't arrived yet at the libertarian movement and some libertarian philosophy in a total sense. But sometimes they do. They see the light. I was in a debate not long ago on open borders, immigration, and on other subjects. And I made the case for open immigration, open borders. And a guy came after me and said, "Jacob, I've been a government control advocate all my life. And after hearing you make the case for open borders, I now realize I've been wrong. And I'm now an open border advocate." All right, so presumably he came in from the conservative movement, and I would venture to say that 98.9% of libertarians who support government-controlled borders came in from the conservative movement with this position. And they just haven't been able to let go of it. But rather than acknowledge that it's not a libertarian position, this is what's fascinating about immigration, is that they have instead try to convince people that this position that's held by Democrats and Republicans, government-controlled borders, is the genuine libertarian position, and not open borders, which has been part of the libertarian philosophy and libertarian movement, for eons. And so, but when in the process of doing that, they're like trying to, in an intellectual sense, drive a square peg into a round hole, because their arguments are in favor of this are totally fallacious. And so that's what I want to address today, which is really, I want to address the principal argument that they use, the main argument that they used to support the notion that government-controlled borders is a libertarian position. And this is where I want to focus in on what Dave Smith said there at this debate. You can find it online. Just Google SOHO debate, New York, Dave Smith, Alex Nowasteh from Cato. And you can find Bob Murphy's podcast. Just put Human Action Podcast. It'll pop up, Bob Murphy, where he's discussing the debate and really bolstering what Dave said during the debate. And then you can find Bob Murphy's podcast, a separate podcast, where he talks with Adam Haman about the debate. They make the same point that Dave made, which this is the point I'm going to be addressed because it's their principal point. Now, there's a lot of course, arguments that the immigration control crowd makes, especially like in the Republican Party and the conservative movement, but a lot of the arguments are inane. But you're not going to get an inane argument out of Dave Smith and Bob Murphy and Adam Haman. You're going to get very stout arguments in an intellectual sense. And that's why I want to deal with this particular thing. I mean, I deal with people regularly every week. I get the emails. We're being invaded, Jacob. We're being invaded. And so it's okay to treat this as an invasion. See, well, you didn't hear the invasion argument from these three guys, and thankfully, and I don't think you ever will. Because it's an inane argument. An invasion is what the U.S. government did to the people of Iraq, okay? Bombs and missiles and soldiers and massive violence, just death and destruction of infrastructure, homes, businesses, occupation. I mean, just really the destruction of the country, maiming people, torturing people. Okay, that's an invasion, okay? When people are crossing a border with babies in their arms and no weapons, they're not shooting people, they're not dropping grenades on positions and so forth, this is not an invasion. These are people that are circumventing the government's immigration control system. But now you might say, but Jacob, there's hordes of people. They're all circumventing the government's control system. Yeah, okay, that means the government's control system isn't working. But they're not wreaking death and destruction and torturing people and all these other things that you saw in Iraq. These are people that are just coming over for whatever reason, better their lives, improve their lives, save their lives. A lot of times they're desperately trying to save their lives from death in their home countries and so forth. But it's not an invasion. In fact, there's what I often tell these people that's, oh, Jacob, we're being invaded, is I remind them about this guy that went down to El Paso. And from Dallas, he drove down there with I think it was an AR-15, and he started shooting Mexicans and Mexican Americans there at Walmart because somebody had convinced him that we're being invaded. And so in his mind, he was killing the invaders, just sort of like, Ukrainians killing Russian invaders of their country. And that was his mind. I'm a patriot. I'm a patriot. I'm protecting the country from invasion. Well, no. He got indicted for murder, and he's now serving a life sentence in prison, and rightly so. It's just out and out murder. There is no invasion. Okay, so you don't hear those arguments from these three guys. But let's start out with the principal argument that Dave makes, and this is what I think that the main argument of the libertarian pro-immigration control crowd. That is the prominent ones, the eloquent ones, the stout ones in the libertarian movement, which is reflected by these three guys. And so Dave says, look. And this point is fortified by Bob and by Adam Haman. He says, the government controls the roads and the government controls the bridge across, let's say, the Rio Grande, and therefore the government has the right to control what it owns. Now, they preface this by saying, well, in an ideal world, there would be no government ownership of property. Okay? Everything would be private. Okay, and if we move over, let's set that argument aside there for now, that the government owns the... Okay, for example, I grew up in Laredo, Texas. All right, it's right on the border. And there is when I was young, there was an international bridge. Now there's, I think, 3 or 4, but international bridge. It connected downtown Laredo from downtown Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. And so that bridge is government owned, okay? And it spans the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande is the border, or more technically, the middle of the Rio Grande is the border. Now, it's an artificial line, the border. You can't see it. It's not like red, like a red line or a red rope or anything. It's it's an imaginary construct. As you're walking across a bridge, you see the river, and you can estimate where the middle is. There might, I think there might be, as a matter of fact, in the middle of the bridge, it might say Mexico or U.S. I'm not really sure. But in any event, the U.S. owns the U.S. side of the bridge, okay? And then Interstate 35 or the streets of Laredo, we didn't have in I-35 when I was a kid, but it connects on to the public streets, which are owned by the government. But let's say it connects to the interstate, which is owned by the government. So what they're saying is, these three guys, is they're saying the government owns this, and therefore the government, as the owner, has the right to decide, or the prerogative, the authority to decide who uses its roads and bridges. And therefore there's nothing wrong with the government controlling immigration. And what is the government? They say, well, the government's majority rule. And so they say, well, clearly the majority doesn't want unrestricted immigration. And so, President Trump's the result of our democratic system. And so it's clear that immigration controls are legitimate, and they're libertarian because the government gets to control what it owns. Now, they point out in an ideal sense that this would all be privately owned. But it's not in the real world. They point that out. But in a private world, they assume, interestingly enough, that private owners would not let immigrants onto their property. And they bring up like a private ranch owner that's complaining that immigrants are trespassing on their ranches and farms. And they did. I grew up on a farm on the Rio Grande. It was right next to the Rio Grande. We pumped water out of the Rio Grande to irrigate our crops. And periodically, illegal immigrants would come into our property. Okay, they were trespassing. And there's nothing legitimate about that. And so one of them pointed out, one of these three guys pointed out, well, the government's not doing a really good job. They're supposed to stop trespassing. But what they don't understand is that the reason that they're trespassing these illegal immigrants onto private property is to circumvent the fact that there's immigration controls at that bridge. In other words, they're going to come in. That's their quest. They're going to enter the United States. They're trying to better their lives. They're trying to improve their lives. They're trying to save their lives. They are intent on entering the United States. In an open border situation, they would just walk across the bridge, just like normal human beings, just walk across the bridge or drive across the bridge, whatever. But they can't do that. That's illegal. So they circumvent. And that's why they trespass. That's why they came onto our farm. If you had open borders, you wouldn't have the trespasses. Now, the assumption of these guys is that in a totally private world, that everybody would take the same position they do. That you get the sense that well, maybe I'm reading more into this. Some immigration control advocates want no immigrants at all. They want no foreigners, or especially not from Latin America, or maybe from Sweden or Norway or whatever. Others, they want a limited number. But their notion is that private individuals really would not want lots of immigrants. Like we've got 10 or 12 million illegals living in the United States. Well, and they're claiming, then they're saying, oh well, Americans would not accept these things if everything was private. Well, that's pure nonsense, because it's clear that 12 million people are living here, estimated, and Americans have accepted them. I mean, they've hired them. Presumably, a lot of them have jobs. Maybe not both parents are working, but at least one of them's working, and they found places to live. So people have rented to them, and they. Let's see, they buy things. You never see any signs at Walmart saying, if you're an illegal immigrant, we do not want to sell to you. And they buy used cars. And so clearly people in the private sector love these people. Well, we hired illegal immigrants. They were the hardest working people I've ever seen on our farm. It was quite incredible. My dad would sometimes go hire somebody from the unemployment lines. They were on unemployment compensation. They were the laziest people you've ever seen. But you didn't see that with illegal immigrants. So the notion that private owners would not want immigrants is belied by the fact that 10 or 12 million immigrants have found their way into the United States and found places in the United States. And the fact that more are still trying to come in, they're saying, oh, there's even more Americans that want us. And let me give you one example of this argument that immigration control advocates in the libertarian movement have never addressed. Never. Okay. And Dave didn't address it, and Bob didn't address it, and Adam didn't address it. They will never address it because it's impossible to confront. And that is this. Suppose you have two landowners. Let's remove the Rio Grande from the equation, and let's go to Arizona or New Mexico. And you got one landowner on the American side and another landowner adjoining ranches. Okay, now remember, the line, the border is you can't see it. It's not there. It's not like a red line there. It's an imaginary construct. I mean, you get a surveyor out there, he'd be able to tell you where the line was. But otherwise, it's you can't see the line. So you've got one brother over here who's an American citizen, but on the other side of the line is another brother, a Mexican citizen. And so the American brother, for whatever reason, there's families on both sides of the river. Anybody who lives down on the border will tell you that. I lived on the border for 30 years. I mean, there's the culture on the border is there are families on both sides. So it wouldn't be unusual that one brother is a Mexican citizen, another brother, for whatever reason, the parents, where they were born and got divorced or whatever. But in any event, so you have this system where they have adjoining ranches and they've got a partnership where they're raising cattle together. And one day the American brother says, hey, why don't you come over for dinner? And the Mexican brother says, great, I'll be there. And so at 6 p.m., the Mexican brother gets on his horse and starts to cross the border and go up a couple of miles to his brother's house. And everything's fine, except all of a sudden, there's pea green vehicles right there on the American brother's land. Now, how to get there? It trespassed, okay? It went from the highway and trespassed, and the American brother says, I don't want you on my land. Get off my land. You don't have authority to be on my land. And they say, well, we're searching for illegal immigrants. It says, well, okay, where's your search warrant? We don't need a search warrant. We control the border, okay? So they trespass on this guy's property, and they go all the way down to the border, the imaginary line there, and the Mexican brother's coming over, and they say, no, show us your official permission. Well, I don't need official permission. I'm going to have dinner with my brother. You're a Mexican. You can't come in to this ranch. And so the brother says, well, I'm going to come in. Well, they will use force. And it could turn out to be deadly force if the Mexican brother persists. Okay, so this is this is how it works with an immigration control system. That in a private property setting where everything's private, which is what these guys say they want. These three guys, ideal world, everything's private, and they say, oh, well, people wouldn't let immigrants in. Well, of course they would. There's 10 or 12 million Americans. You've got this example of two brothers that want to interact with each other, and that's what would happen if the roads and the highways were private. Now, what are highways and what are streets? Really, they're just a means by which people go from private property to private property. It's a means to facilitate commerce, facilitate people going from one point to another point. There's no reason they have to be government owned. My hunch is that if the government had never gotten into this business, it would have been the store owners that were building the streets and the highways for free. To get people into their stores where they wouldn't be even charging. They'd be happy that people would be out there coming to Walmart and Costco or wherever, or for people to go visit each other in their homes. So the streets would facilitate that. Now they could charge. There's nothing that says they couldn't. But what these three guys say, okay, the reality is that we live in a government-owned society where a government owns certain things, okay? And so what they're saying is that if the government owns it, the government can control how it's operated. And they turn to the example of public schools. Dave Smith used public schools, and Bob used it, and I think Haman did too, Adam Haman. So here's their analogy on the public school situation. They say, well, public schools, we'd all agree as libertarians that there should be no public schools. There should be a separation of school and state. Government has no more business in education than it does in religion. And so that being the case, each private school, private educational endeavor could decide, who they wanted to enter the school. But we do have public government schools. They're government run. And so the government, since it's the owner of the school, has the authority to run the school the way it wants. And so they bring up this example of a 55-year-old drug addict that just walks into the public school and goes into the girls' bathroom. And to the principle that, well, the public school belongs to everybody and freedom of movement and they open schools, and so this guy's got the right to do this. I don't know why they use a 55-year-old man. I mean, it seems to me that this argument applies to any man or any boy. You would not want to go into a girl's bathroom, whether a drug addict or not. I didn't quite get the whole idea of the 50-year-old or 55-year-old man. But what they're trying to say is that government has to control the public school to ensure this doesn't happen. If you have no controls and you say, freedom of movement, then you'd have this situation where men could come off the street and just walk into the girls' bathroom. Now, there's no question about the fact that when government owns something, government has to control it. I mean, a government owns a courthouse. Okay, it has to determine how that courthouse is going to be run. With ownership comes control. The problem with government ownership of things like, the post office or public schools or highways or whatever is that some cases are clear cut. I mean, there's no question about the fact that, men are not going to be allowed in the girls' bathroom. Nobody's going to question that. No reasonable person's going to question that. And that the government's decision to bar this is perfectly legitimate. But then there's also other cases that are very difficult to resolve. Should there be prayer in public schools? Okay, well, the conservatives would say, absolutely. We got to teach God in education. It's very important. But somebody else would say, well, wait a minute, there's something called the First Amendment, freedom of religion, and which is incorporated by reference by the 14th Amendment, which applies to the states. And these are state government institutions. We don't want to have the state teaching religion. I mean, that's the Constitution bars that. And it's something bad anyway. We don't, people are forced to be in these public school systems, compulsory attendance laws. And so we would say, okay, well, that's a no-brainer. We're not going to have public schools teaching religion, whether it's Muslims or whatever. Now, some might argue, but you should do majority rule, Jacob. Majority rule. We're a democracy. All right, well, what if the majority school district is Muslim? Well, I got a feeling that's going to upset people, especially the small minority of Christians who are being forced into the system to learn Islam and Sharia law and so forth. Now, there's other issues that are problematic. Should the uniforms in public schools or searching of lockers without search warrants, and that there are issues that are difficult, and it's inevitably the decision is arbitrary. There's no black and white issue. There is on the bathroom issue, there is on the church and state issue, but there's a whole range of issues in there that are difficult to resolve and inevitably turn out to be arbitrary. And that's simply because of government ownership of of property. Now, it's the same thing with respect to highways and bridges and so forth. Let me go back to the public school example for a minute, though, because I think it's instructive on the immigration issue. Let's say a public school says, okay, we control it. Let's say that Bob and Adam and Dave Smith say public schools should be able to keep out the 50-year-old man, that was their example, heroin addict from the girls' bathroom, and therefore really keep him out of the public schools because that's a good thing. That's they have ownership over this and they should control it. You can't just let everybody roll into there. Okay. Well, now, what if they decide, the public school district, not to let blacks into the schools? Well, that's the argument that was being made in the 1950s and 1960s, that we control the public school system, the state does, the state of Alabama, and therefore we can bar not just 50-year-old men that want to go into the bathroom, which was their example again. I think we would say they should bar all men and all boys in the girls' bathroom, or even roaming around the school if they're not a student. But the idea is that since they have this control, they can block out blacks, keep out blacks. And that was the argument that was used in the South, that we're going to keep out blacks. And it's majority vote. You see, there's more whites in Alabama than there are blacks, so they take a vote. We're under democracy. And so where would Dave and Adam and Bob fall on this issue? Well, it's not clear. They don't address it, interestingly enough. Where do they stand on this particular? Should a public school be allowed to bar blacks? Well, there's a big obstacle. Okay, you've got the 14th Amendment again, okay, which guarantees that equal protection for everyone. Okay? So that means regardless of race, color, creed, or national origin, you can't bar people based on those positions from the public schools. That's our constitutional system. So, I mean, another issue to ask them, okay, in addition to blacks, what if a public school votes to say no immigrants? If you're not a citizen, you can't come into the public school. Where would Adams and Dave and Bob fall on that one? Okay, not clear. They don't make that clear. It's a very uncomfortable position, though, isn't it? Question of what should be the answer here. They want to use the government highways and roads to keep out immigrants, all right, and possibly blacks too. Okay, but we'll get to that in a minute. But how would they fall down on the issue that was really taken in a real life sense in the South? Now, to get around the Equal Protection Clause, what the state officials did was they said, okay, we're going to have separate but equal facilities. So they built public schools for blacks and public schools for whites, and they said they're equal, they're separate, but they're equal. So the Equal Protection Clause is satisfied. And I guess if they were going to bar immigrants too, they'd have to build separate schools for immigrants. So here you have a situation that is very problematic from the standpoint of these guys that favor immigration controls and the right of the majority to decide through the state who's going to be using that facility. So I don't know where they come out on that, but I do know where they come out, at least on immigrants, on highways. So now we go back to highways and the International Bridge there at Laredo, and they're saying the government owns this, and therefore the government can control who uses it through majority vote, because they say we're a democracy, and so democracy decides, who's gonna use the roads and the highways. So, following that logic, if the will of the majority is that blacks will not use highways and roads and so forth, that's it. Okay, done. That they're just going to have to find another way to get around using helicopters or whatever, because the government owns the roads and the highways, and as the owner, like the owner of the school, it has a right to decide who can use the highways and the roads, not just immigrants, but everybody. So if you want to bar blacks or Jews or Muslims or immigrants or whatever, just majority vote makes it determinative. And how do they decide the majority vote? Well, Donald Trump's elected president. That shows you that people favor immigration controls, and therefore the government can bar the use of highways and streets and roads to immigrants or to blacks or Jews or whoever. All right, well, except that there's one big obstacle here, okay? And again, you've got the equal protection problem. That the federal government is not given the power, and the Constitution set up a government of limited powers to discriminate against people on the basis of race, color, creed, or national origin. That principle was then later adopted in the 14th Amendment, which operates as a restriction on the states, because that's the way the system works. If you want to restrict the states, you got to have an express restriction. But if you want to bar the federal government, you just don't delegate that power to them. And there was no power delegated to the federal government to discriminate against people on the basis of race, color, creed, or national origin. So immediately they run into this obstacle, the immigration control advocates. Because what they're saying is that the government has the power of control, except what they're not recognizing is there is a limitation on that control. And that is that you cannot exercise the control in a racist manner, in a manner that discriminates against a person on the basis of race, color, creed, or national origin. So their system doesn't work in terms of, or their rationale doesn't work in terms of what they're saying is that the government owns it and therefore the government should control, has the legitimate authority to control this situation. Now, there is one issue that determines all of this. I said earlier that there's libertarians that say, oh, there's two positions in the libertarian movement now, immigration control and open borders. And I'm not sure where Dave and Adam and Bob come out on that, but what I do know is that they're saying the legitimate libertarian position is government-controlled borders. But how do we decide this? Did we decide it by majority vote? Did we decide it by the vote in a debate as to which side people favor? No. There's a way to determine whether an issue is libertarian or not, and that's what's called the libertarian non-aggression principle. That if a position involves the initiation of force, then it's not libertarian, regardless of what the majority says. Let's say you can have 95% of libertarians saying, I favor government-controlled borders, Jacob. Okay. But you're holding a non-libertarian position even if you're part of the 95%. Why? Because your position involves the initiation of force. And they didn't deal with this in this debate or in these podcast commentaries that follow the debate. And they never do, for obvious reasons. If they did, they'd have to acknowledge that their position is not the libertarian position. So best let's not talk about it. Okay. Now, how do we know that their position involves the initiation of force? Well, it's easy. Every day there's hundreds of thousands of people crossing the bridge from Maryland into Virginia. Okay. There's no government control station there. We have open borders, which is kind of interesting. We have a totally open border system here in the United States, which most Americans believe in and favor, but they're not able to apply the principle intellectually to international borders. But domestically, I think most people favor open borders. And so you've got all these people coming into Virginia that are not vetted. Murderers, rapists, thieves, robbers, rapists, illegal immigrants, drug traffickers, communists, terrorists, whatever. They're all crossing over the border and coming to get us, okay? But nobody's initiating force. When they cross that bridge, they don't violate rights. They're not initiating force against me or anyone else. Now, if they come and rob me, okay, now they're initiating force. But the mere fact that somebody crosses a political border is not initiating force. So when somebody crosses the bridge at Laredo, as soon as he crosses that midpoint line, he hasn't violated anybody's rights. He's violated the law, but that's what we're questioning, whether that law is legitimate. Now, as soon as an immigration official accosts that person and says, you're not going, and obstructs him, that's the initiation of force. That's how we know that the immigration control position is not the libertarian position, because their position necessarily involves the initiation of force. So if all of a sudden the state of Virginia set up a border control station there at the bridge from Maryland and stopped people there and searched them and said, show me your papers and what are you coming into Virginia for? And do you have a criminal record? No, they're the ones that are initiating force. Okay. So that's how we know that the immigration position is not libertarian. So, but obviously they didn't address this debate. They never do. They never do. Just like they never addressed that example of the two brothers on the border, because they can't. But here's the big issue that they didn't address. And it's the issue I have raised for, decades. And they never raise it for obvious reasons, as we'll see why they don't address it. And that's the police state that comes with the immigration control system. Now, every libertarian, I think, would agree that a police state is not libertarian. Okay, a police state is the opposite of libertarian, because libertarianism is about freedom. The police state is about the destruction of freedom. So you can't have a free society with a police state. Okay, contradictions again. Okay, libertarianism is a consistent philosophy. Libertarianism does not embrace police states, but yet the immigration control system comes with a police state. And I thought, well, okay, maybe they're going to address it in this debate. Maybe Alex would address it, but Alex didn't bring it up, and I think you'll see why in a minute when I address his arguments. But when I saw that Bob Murphy, who's like really prominent libertarian, smart guy, he was going to do it. He did an hour podcast. And I said, okay, I'm going to listen to this whole podcast because I know he's going to address the police state aspect of this. He's got a whole hour. And, oh, nope, not one. Oh, well, with one exception. This is really fascinating from Bob's podcast, but no real mention of the police state and how you reconcile that with your position that you say is libertarian. Now, one of the interesting aspects of Bob's presentation is he alludes to it. And he's clearly discomforted by it. I found it very fascinating because he's the first libertarian advocate of immigration controls that I've seen that has alluded to the police state aspect of this. When he said, well, we know that there's people that have been living here, illegals. They've been living here illegally. He acknowledges that. And I think the example he uses is for 5 years, and they have families that have grown up here, and they have jobs, and when you grab them and you remove them from their jobs, it hurts the business. The business might go under. The businesses that they were buying groceries from, they're hurt. And he doesn't come out and say, but he almost proposes, let's leave them alone. Which I found absolutely fascinating and encouraging, because what he's really saying is amnesty. That's what I think he's suggesting. Let's give amnesty. Now, he didn't say how long they should be here before they do that. He used a 5-year example, but what he said was to get around this problem, okay, because he clearly considers it a problem. He's discomforted by it, which I think is a good sign. He says, we need to just stop them at the border before they get in. Okay? We need to fortify the border, sort of like North Korea, just seal that border, and then we don't have this problem of them settling in and becoming part of the community and raising their children and so forth. And but he didn't give a time frame. I mean, let's say somebody circumvents the sealed border and gets in. Is he now in free under Bob's formulation? Or does he have to be here for a while? Okay, does he have to be here 5 years? What time limit is Bob talking about with this interesting proposal? Well, he didn't say. One option is as soon as they set foot in the United States, they're home free. They're in. They got past the border. Or another option is they have to be here 30 days, and then nothing can be done. Well, but remember that I think most immigration control advocates would never buy that formulation, because it means that the illegals, the ones that broke the law, get to stay. And so I think it's encouraging that Bob's discomforted by the police state aspects in the rest of the country. But I don't think Dave would ever accept that at all, that proposal. Adam seemed a bit receptive to it, but I think the standard would be, no way. They're illegals, deport them, which is exactly what's going on now. But what's interesting about Bob's formulation and this debate and Adam's commentary, they don't deal with the police state aspects on the border. Okay? I mean, this is when Bob is saying we need to seal the border, we need to stop them from coming in, what he doesn't recognize, or at least doesn't talk about, he might recognize it, is you need a police state to do that. It's not just a do not enter sign. That's the way these guys think. They think, oh, just put do not enter. No entren aquí en los Estados Unidos sin el permiso oficial del gobierno federal. You do not enter without the official permission of the U.S. government. And that's all. It's just a sign all along the border. Nobody's going to pay attention to that sign because we're dealing with laws of supply and demand. that people hear that there's a wage rate being offered in Oregon of $50 an hour to pick crops. They're on the bus and they're going up there because $50 is what they make in a month in Mexico or Guatemala or whatever. I'm just throwing out figures here, but they're not going to pay attention to the do not enter sign. And so that's to enforce the do not enter sign. That's where the police state comes in. So if you take, for example, highway checkpoints. In Laredo, they got a highway checkpoint 40 miles north of town. You come over a crest of a hill, and man, there's a Border Patrol checkpoint. It's surreal. You think you're in Mexico approaching the U.S. border, where they can tell you to get out of your car, show your papers, open your trunk, have dogs come around searching for drugs or whatever, illegal immigrants. It's incredible. I mean, this is what they have in totalitarian countries. What does Dave and Bob and Adam say about those checkpoints? We don't know. We don't know what any, because they never address this. There's also roving Border Patrol checkpoints where they just stop anybody they want on the highway. I was the victim of one of those in high school. The guy just pulls me over. And I said, "What'd you pull me over for?" "Because I want you to open your trunk." But that was it. No probable cause, no reasonable suspicion. That's what it's like to live in a police state. Now, people are accustomed to it. People on the border are accustomed to it. And they honestly think they live in a free society. It's a massive police state down there on the border with these kind of things. Warrantless searches. Okay, so in the process of Bob's commentary and the debate, the statement is made, well, the government controls the borders. Well, that gives the case away. So like when the Border Patrol would come onto our farm, they would just enter. Okay? And you say, "What are you doing here?" We're searching for illegal immigrants. We're controlling the border. Okay? That's what I'm questioning, is whether they have the legitimate authority to trespass to go control the border. If they wanted to control the border, all they'd have to do is go to the International Bridge, downtown Laredo, put a boat in, and go up the river. They didn't have to trespass on our property to go look at the river, which is the border. But that's what they do without a search warrant. And if they've caught us hiring illegal immigrants, which we did, the hardest working people I've ever seen, they would bust them, arrest them, take them back and deport them to Mexico without a search warrant. Where do Bob and Dave and Adam, where do they fit on this? What do they say about these warrantless searches? We don't know. We don't know what any immigration control advocate talks about these police state measures, because they never talk about them. And you can see why. Because they're claiming that they're not just claiming we hold this statist position as libertarians, and we recognize it's an exception to the libertarian philosophy. They're saying this is the libertarian position. Well, then what are they going to say? Libertarianism includes a police state along the border? I mean, if you really want to totally seal the border, you got to do what North Korea does, troops along the border. The Berlin Wall down there, okay? Eminent domain stealing. That's how they got the property to build the wall. Like if we had still owned our farm, they would just come in and say, "We're taking the lower pasture here, the one that adjoins the Rio Grande, and we're going to build a wall here. And we're going to steal your property through eminent domain." That's implicitly what Dave, Bob, and Haman are endorsing when they say they want a wall there. Eminent domain stealing of people's property. Okay, they pay compensation, but it's not a voluntary transfer. And so you've also got the criminalization of hiring illegal immigrants. It wasn't a criminal offense when I was a kid, but it became a criminal offense because they said, "Oh, well, our police state isn't working, our highway checkpoints, our roving Border Patrol checkpoints, so we need to have harsher measures, police state measures, so we're going to criminalize the hiring of illegal immigrants." Okay, and this is what kind of makes Bob uncomfortable up in the Midwest, for example, when somebody has been working here for 5 years or so. Okay, well, that's a criminal offense to hire those people. And they prosecute American businessmen who hire illegal immigrants. Caring for illegal immigrants. If you see an illegal immigrant on the highway along the border that's dying of thirst, just collapsed on the highway, you don't even want to put them in your car unless you want to risk being charged with a felony. And that's their position. You care for an illegal immigrant, whether he's starving to death, dying of thirst, or whatever, they will come after you. And they did. They went after a guy in, I think it was Tucson, somewhere around there. Classic case of jury nullification. It was fantastic. They proved the guy's guilt. He really had cared for these people and helped save their lives. And they charged him with this felony offense of harboring illegal immigrants or caring for illegal immigrants. And the jury came back in and nullified and found him not guilty, much to the chagrin of the federal officials, of course. But transporting illegal immigrants, you see, and you see these deaths that occur when these illegal immigrants are in the back of the 18-wheelers. They die of dehydration or heat exhaustion or whatever. That's because of the system. You see, if open borders existed, they wouldn't have to be transported like that. So you've got people drowning in the Rio Grande now with the concertina wire they've put up there. Cuts people up. They put it under the water. You've got people boarding Greyhound buses looking for people's papers. If you don't have your papers and you're on the bus going to San Antonio from Laredo, you're taken off that bus and you're sent back to Laredo. I mean, I know this from experience. We had a nanny growing up who never spoke English. And she'd go to visit my brothers and sisters in Dallas or San Antonio on the bus. She had to take her passport. She never got a driver's license. She never spoke English. She didn't learn English until the day she died. She was around 90, 91. So what? I mean, there's a lot of people in Laredo that don't speak English, and nobody cares, okay? I mean, it's no big surprise. This is the land that the United States stole from Mexico in the Mexican War. And so some things do not change immediately. And so she didn't speak English, but you have to take her passport. Imagine taking your passport to take a bus inside the United States. This is you got to take your papers. That's what they mean when they say carry your papers. And that's what's done in totalitarian countries. So you've got a border police state. I mean, you go down there, man. You go to Dunkin' Donuts, and you're going to see DEA agents, ICE agents, Border Patrol, FBI, Homeland Security. It's a veritable police state along the border. And it's now expanding nationwide. We can see them using immigration controls to destroy freedom of speech for anybody that, criticizes Israel. Or the Israeli government, to be more specific. And they're using immigration controls, but the principle applies to the American people too. They're using this immigration control system to destroy due process of law, to destroy habeas corpus, which is the linchpin of a free society. And so while the immigration control advocates sit there and cheer, yay, yay, President Trump, thank you for sending those immigrants to that torture penitentiary center for terrorists in El Salvador, where they're disappeared for the rest of their lives possibly. And thank you for using this invasion rationale for destroying habeas corpus. We're the ones going to ultimately pay the price. But here's the point: is that if they end up succeeding in sealing the border, the probability is that nobody wants to come into the United States anyway. You already see that. A lot of tourists are staying away from the United States. It's becoming an unattractive place to come. And when they do that, they say, oh, see, we won. No more immigrants want to come to the United States. But that's a high price to pay as far as I'm concerned. But there's a much higher price to pay. But I think it's a price that the libertarian immigration control advocates are willing to pay. And that price is the total destruction of freedom. That is that, you've got a police state along the border with all the things I just mentioned. And now you've got the destruction of due process and freedom of speech. I think there might be some libertarian immigration control advocates that would say, Jacob, it's worth it. We seal the border. Well, to me, it's not worth it. I'm a libertarian. I'm about freedom. I want to live in a free society. I don't want to live in a police state. And so this brings us back to the idea that open borders is the only philosophy that's consistent with freedom. And we see that domestically. We don't have an immigration control system here. Now, I've known of one libertarian that calls for immigration controls between each state, where each state can control the highways, you see. Well, if the state owns a highway that connects to Maryland, that bridge there, the state of Virginia has the right to bar people from Maryland from coming in, okay, or blacks from coming in, or immigrants from coming into Virginia. And so But we have a system of open borders, and notice how it works. It's fluid, it's harmonious. Nobody sits there and worries about, oh my gosh, who's coming into Virginia, who's coming to get me, and whatever. It's just whoever's coming is coming, and life is not secure. It could be murderers and rapists and thieves and terrorists and Reds and Muslims or whoever, but life is never totally safe. But if you trade your liberty in trying to get security and safety, you get neither one. And you really don't deserve either one. And Franklin made that point, Ben Franklin. Now, let me address finally the Alex Nowasteh's position, because this is billed as an open borders versus government-controlled borders, which it really isn't, okay? And it gets so tedious for me when I hear these debates and I see these debates. Oh, there's going to be an open border debate between a government-controlled libertarian and an open borders libertarian. But the open borders libertarian, and I put that in quotation marks, is almost always not an open borders libertarian. He's instead what's called the Ellis Island libertarian, okay? And that's Alex's position. He's an Ellis Island libertarian. Now, what does that mean? Well, okay, in the late 1800s, you had Ellis Island in New York, and over on the West Coast, you had Angel Island, which was the counterpart. And they let in most immigrants, okay? But let is the operative word here. This was a government control facility. Okay, everybody was funneled into this government control facility where they were inspected, and some of these inspections were very unpleasant. I mean, immigrants hated it because, like, women were required at Ellis Island to remove their blouses and their bras so that the panel of men could inspect them to make sure they didn't have diseases around their breasts. And the same with men. Men had to drop their trousers and their underwear so they could be inspected by a panel of men to determine the same thing. So immigrants hated this type of thing. But what matters here, this is a government control system. Now, granted, it was more benign. Government let in most of the immigrants, let's say 97%, 96%, and it's considered a better system by Alex and other pro-immigrant libertarians than a system that, let's say, totally sealed border. Now, I don't know where Dave Smith and Bob fit on the spectrum, whether they want to totally seal the border and don't let any immigrants whatsoever, or whether they want to just bar Latin American immigrants and let in Swedish immigrants, or let in 40% of the immigrants, arbitrary number. What matters here is that regardless of your immigration control system, we're dealing with what is called in socialism central planning. And these guys know central planning. Bob is an Austrian economist. Dave knows a lot about Austrian economics. So does Adam. They all know what I'm talking about with central planning. Central planning is what Ludwig von Mises says produces planned chaos, because it's not the free market. It's not the laws of supply and demand. It's not farmers raising their prices to $50 an hour to attract labor. It's a government central planner deciding how many immigrants, what their qualifications are going to be, how many quotas from each country. And central planning produces what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos. Always. Central planning equals planned chaos. And that's what we've had on the border. All my life is chaos, along with death, suffering, a police state, and so forth. And so you've got this massive dysfunctional system down there. You still have central planning under the Ellis Island system. It's government deciding who are the ones they're going to bar, okay, that prohibit. It might start out with imbeciles, but inevitably it starts expanding. It goes to, prostitutes. So now you got to determine which of the women coming in are prostitutes. That's an interesting exercise. And then it expands to Chinese. That's what the Chinese Exclusion Act was about in 1880. Go on YouTube and watch some videos on the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's horrific. It is absolutely horrific. But you see, this is the mindset that government controls the border and controls the seashore, and therefore government can bar Chinese if they want to. It was horrific what they were doing. And then Jews, they barred Jews from entering the United States. When Hitler was willing to let go of the Jews from Nazi Germany in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt said, no. We control the borders. We control our immigration system. We have quotas. We've already filled the quota for Germany. And so those people died in the Holocaust. They didn't have to die in the Holocaust, at least not the German Jews. They could have all come to the United States except for immigration controls. So you've got the system of central planning that inevitably starts expanding. Now, I've heard libertarians say, well, Jacob, but let's just vest government with the power to do it, but hope that government does the plan like we want. Like Alex says, this is the way I want government immigration controls to work. Okay, fine. But that's not what happens in real life. The wrong people get into power, and they start exercising it in ways that are very, very destructive. But what's important here is that this is not an open border debate. This is a debate between which central plan is better. Which central plan should be adopted? Should it be a central plan that involves government control, Ellis Island, that lets in 95% of immigrants? Should it be the Angel Island kind of system that bars Chinese and other Asians? Should it be one that bars blacks from coming into the United States, Jews from coming in? You see, and that's why these debates that are so-called open border debates become so tedious for me, because they never involve open borders. What they've done is they've redefined the Ellis Island system as open borders. Okay, so if you favor the Ellis Island, where you're going to let in 95%, and remember, let is the operative word. When you hear the word let, you're not talking freedom. You're talking permission. Okay, the government gives permission. That's not freedom. Freedom is the exercise of fundamental rights without having to get government permission, like pursuit of happiness. That's a fundamental right. Jefferson tells us that. We celebrate it every 4th of July. It adheres to everybody in the world. Okay, it pre-exists government. The right to pursue happiness. And if you have to ask for permission, may I pursue happiness? Well, you're not free. You're a serf. You're a slave. You're asking for permission to do something that is really a natural God-given right. So that's why these debates become tedious for me, because they're not really an open border. You see, if you have a clear debate between an immigration control advocate like Dave Smith or Bob Murphy or Adam Haman versus somebody that advocates genuine open borders. Now, what do I mean by open borders? Because you see, they've redefined open borders to mean Ellis Island government control systems. A real open border system is what we have domestically. Okay, no border patrol, no immigration service, no DEA, no restrictions whatsoever. We don't have restrictions between Maryland and Virginia or any other state. Free movements of goods, services, and people. That is open borders. Now that would be a legitimate debate between Bob and Adam and Dave on one side and three open borders advocates on this side, but not Ellis Island advocates. Okay? Instead, genuine open borders, it says we don't want government involvement in this at all. Now you have a real debate rather than what I think is a faux debate, a fake debate between which immigration control plan should be adopted. So that's my commentary on this whole immigration debate. Again, you can find that debate online. Just type in SOHO debate, Alex Nowasteh and Dave Smith, and you can find Bob Murphy's commentary, Human Action Podcast, and then you can find his conversation with Adam Haman over on Bob Murphy's podcast. I think it's on Spotify. And thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.